Have you ever noticed that some people seem completely confident until the moment someone quietly walks away, not with anger, not with revenge, not with dramatic speeches or emotional outbursts, just silence, just distance, just emotional detachment? Here's what most people completely miss. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, emotional control often matters more than love itself. It's not always about winning your heart. It's about knowing they can still influence your emotions. As long as they can make you angry, guilty, hopeful, or desperate, they still feel connected to your attention. But the moment that emotional connection disappears, something unexpected happens. The strange part is that emotional detachment isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. There are no dramatic exits or perfectly crafted goodbye messages. In fact, genuine emotional detachment often looks incredibly ordinary. You stop explaining yourself. You stop chasing closure. You stop reacting to every text, every insult, every attempt to pull you back into the same emotional cycle. Psychologically, this creates a situation that many narcissistic personalities struggle to process. Their usual strategies suddenly stop producing the same results. The predictable emotional reactions they've relied on become unpredictable. And when predictable patterns disappear, uncertainty takes their place. Have you ever wondered why someone suddenly becomes more persistent only after you've stopped caring? Why they reach out after months of silence? Why they seem more interested once you've emotionally moved on? It isn't always because they've changed. Sometimes it's because they've lost access to something they depended on without even realizing it. By the end of this video, you'll understand the hidden psychology behind why narcissists often find an empath's emotional detachment so difficult to handle. More importantly, you'll learn how emotional independence changes relationship dynamics, protects your mental well-being, and reveals behavioral patterns that are almost invisible while you're still emotionally invested. And that's exactly what we're exploring today. Why narcissists can't handle an empath's emotional detachment. One of the biggest misconceptions about narcissistic behavior is that it's driven purely by confidence or self-love. In reality, many narcissistic patterns are built around something much more fragile: the constant need for emotional reinforcement. Whether that reinforcement comes through admiration, fear, guilt, arguments, or even your attempts to fix the relationship, it serves the same psychological purpose. It reassures them that they still have influence over your emotional world. This is where an empath often becomes deeply involved without realizing it. Empaths naturally want to understand people. When conflict appears, they ask questions. They explain their intentions. They apologize even when they aren't fully responsible. They try to repair misunderstandings because preserving emotional harmony feels important to them. But here's where it gets interesting. Every emotional reaction, even a negative one, can unintentionally reinforce unhealthy relationship dynamics. If every criticism leads to a long explanation, every cold shoulder leads to chasing, or every manipulation leads to another emotional conversation, the pattern quietly rewards the behavior. Over time, both people begin playing predictable roles without recognizing the cycle they're trapped inside. Have you ever noticed how some arguments never really end? The topic changes, but the emotional dance stays exactly the same. That's because the real pattern isn't about solving problems. It's about maintaining emotional engagement. When an empath reaches genuine emotional detachment, something remarkable happens. They don't necessarily stop caring about people. They stop feeding unhealthy cycles. Instead of reacting immediately, they pause. Instead of defending every accusation, they accept that not every misunderstanding needs correction. Instead of trying to convince someone to see their perspective, they become comfortable letting others hold opinions they cannot control. Psychologically, This creates uncertainty for someone who has grown accustomed to predictable emotional responses. Human beings naturally seek patterns because patterns create a sense of control. When those patterns suddenly disappear, the brain begins searching for ways to restore them. Imagine someone who always knew exactly which buttons to press. If criticism made you cry, they expected tears. If silence made you panic, they expected repeated messages. If jealousy made you chase reassurance, they expected another emotional conversation. Then one day, none of those buttons work anymore. The silence isn't cold, it's calm. The absence of emotional reaction becomes louder than any argument ever was. That shift can feel deeply unsettling because it removes the emotional certainty they once relied on. Instead of controlling the emotional atmosphere, they're suddenly forced to sit with unpredictability. And uncertainty is something many people with strong narcissistic tendencies find extremely uncomfortable. This doesn't mean emotional detachment is a strategy to punish someone. Healthy detachment isn't about winning a psychological battle. It's about reclaiming ownership of your own emotional responses. You're no longer allowing another person's behavior to dictate your peace of mind, and that changes the entire relationship dynamic. But emotional independence doesn't just remove emotional reinforcement. It also exposes something far more uncomfortable, a loss of control that many narcissistic personalities never expected. And that's where the psychology becomes even more revealing. Control in relationships rarely looks the way people imagine. It isn't always obvious demands, raised voices, or direct commands. More often, it appears through subtle emotional patterns that develop over time. One person learns which words trigger guilt. Another learns that withdrawing affection creates anxiety. Before long, both people begin reacting almost automatically, as though they're following an invisible script. This is why emotional independence can feel so disruptive. Here's what most people completely miss. Narcissistic behavior often depends less on controlling your actions and more on predicting your emotional responses. If they know exactly how you'll react, they can shape the conversation before it even begins. Predictability creates influence, and influence creates the comforting illusion that they are still in control. An empath, especially one who values connection, may unknowingly make those reactions easy to predict. They answer every message immediately. They defend themselves against every accusation. They constantly seek reassurance after conflict because they genuinely want peace. While those behaviors come from kindness, they can also become emotionally predictable. But have you ever noticed what happens when someone suddenly stops trying to prove they're a good person? The accusations lose their power. The guilt stops landing. The emotional traps begin to fail. Imagine a woman who spent years explaining every misunderstanding to her partner. Every disagreement turned into hours of defending her intentions, hoping that if she found the right words, everything would finally make sense. Then, after months of personal growth, she simply says, "I understand that's how you see it," and calmly ends the conversation. There's no anger, no desperate explanation, no emotional collapse. For someone expecting the usual pattern, that response feels confusing. The familiar emotional map has disappeared. They may try harder, becoming unusually charming one day and unexpectedly critical the next, because they're searching for the reaction they used to receive. It's not necessarily a conscious plan. It's often an instinctive attempt to restore a pattern that once felt reliable. This changes everything. Emotional independence doesn't create distance because you stop caring about people. It creates distance because you stop allowing fear, guilt, or obligation to control your decisions. You begin responding with intention instead of reacting from emotion. That shift also changes your body language. Your posture becomes more relaxed. Your voice stays steady instead of rushed. You maintain comfortable eye contact without trying to convince anyone of your worth. These nonverbal signals communicate confidence far more powerfully than any speech ever could. People sense that your emotional center is no longer available to be pulled in every direction. Almost nobody realizes how much influence calm behavior carries. A regulated nervous system is difficult to manipulate because it isn't searching for immediate emotional relief. It can tolerate discomfort without abandoning its own boundaries. This is why emotional detachment often feels so threatening to someone who relied on emotional predictability. The illusion of control begins to fade, and with it comes something they may have avoided for a long time: the realization that another person's inner peace cannot be owned. And once that realization begins to sink in, many narcissistic personalities make a surprising mistake. Instead of accepting the change, they often intensify their efforts to regain attention, revealing behavioral patterns that were hidden all along. One of the most revealing moments in any unhealthy relationship doesn't happen during an argument. It happens after the argument no longer works. This is the point where emotional detachment acts like a spotlight, exposing behavioral patterns that were once hidden beneath constant emotional noise. Here's what most people completely miss: manipulation is often invisible while it's succeeding. When you're emotionally invested, your focus stays on solving the immediate problem. You're trying to explain yourself, repair the relationship, or restore peace. You rarely have the mental space to step back and ask a much more important question: why does the same pattern keep repeating? An empath is especially vulnerable to this cycle because they naturally search for understanding before judgment. They assume that if someone behaves badly, there must be a deeper wound, a painful past, or a misunderstanding that can be resolved through patience and compassion. While empathy is a beautiful strength, it can become a blind spot when it repeatedly excuses behaviors that consistently damage emotional safety. But here's where it gets interesting. The moment an empath emotionally detaches, their perspective changes. Instead of asking, "How can I fix this?" they begin asking, "Why am I always the one trying to fix it?" That single shift in thinking transforms everything. Imagine a man who has spent years apologizing after every disagreement, even when he wasn't at fault. Every conflict ends the same way. He explains his intentions, accepts responsibility for keeping the peace, and convinces himself that next time will be different. Then one day, he calmly listens to another accusation and simply replies, "I don't agree with that, but I respect your right to feel that way." He doesn't argue. He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't chase approval after the conversation ends. Suddenly, the emotional script falls apart. Without the expected reaction, the other person may escalate. They might become unusually affectionate, hoping to pull him back into emotional closeness. If that doesn't work, they may become critical, reminding him of old mistakes or questioning his character. If criticism fails, they may play the victim, suggesting they've been abandoned or misunderstood. These rapid emotional shifts aren't random. They're often attempts to discover which emotional door is still open. Have you ever noticed how someone's behavior sometimes becomes more extreme only after you've stopped reacting? That's because emotional detachment removes the reward that kept the old pattern alive. When one strategy no longer produces attention, another strategy often appears. What once looked like isolated incidents suddenly reveals itself as a predictable sequence of behaviors. This doesn't mean every difficult person is consciously planning each move. Human behavior is often driven by learned habits rather than deliberate schemes. People repeat what has worked for them in the past. If guilt once restored connection, guilt becomes the default response. If charm once repaired conflict, charm returns. If anger once regained attention, anger becomes familiar territory. This is where self-awareness becomes your greatest protection. Instead of asking whether someone is being nice or cruel in a particular moment, begin observing consistency over time. Do their actions match their words? Do apologies lead to lasting change or only temporary calm? Are conflicts resolved or simply repeated with different details? Emotionally detached people stop judging relationships by promises and start evaluating them through patterns. They understand that behavior repeated over months tells a far more accurate story than emotional speeches delivered in a single evening. And perhaps the most powerful realization is this: you don't have to expose manipulation for it to lose its power. You simply have to stop participating in it. When your peace is no longer dependent on another person's approval, manipulation begins to lose its influence naturally. And that's exactly why emotional detachment feels so unsettling to someone who depended on controlling the emotional atmosphere. But the psychology goes even deeper. Once manipulation stops working, many narcissistic personalities experience something they rarely know how to handle: a profound injury to their self-image. And that hidden psychological wound explains some of their most confusing behaviors. One of the least understood aspects of narcissistic behavior is that it often revolves around protecting a carefully constructed self-image. On the surface, a person with strong narcissistic traits may appear highly confident, emotionally unaffected, or completely certain of their own importance. But beneath that exterior, their sense of identity can depend heavily on how other people respond to them. This is why an empath's emotional detachment creates such a powerful psychological shift. Here's what most people completely miss. For someone who has become accustomed to being the center of another person's emotional world, your reactions become part of how they see themselves. Your admiration reinforces their confidence. Your arguments confirm they still have influence. Even your tears or attempts to fix the relationship can reassure them that they remain emotionally significant. But what happens when those reactions quietly disappear? Not because you've become cold, not because you're trying to punish them, but because you've finally accepted that your peace is more valuable than constant emotional conflict. That silence creates something deeply uncomfortable, a gap between how they expect to be seen and what they're actually experiencing. The emotional mirror they relied on no longer reflects the same image back to them. Have you ever noticed that some people become surprisingly obsessed with proving themselves right after you've stopped arguing? It isn't always about winning the conversation. Sometimes it's about protecting the identity they've built around always being right, always being admired, or always having the final word. Imagine a woman who has finally reached emotional clarity after years of being blamed for every disagreement. In the past, she would spend hours defending herself, hoping to restore harmony. Now, when another accusation comes, she calmly says, "I don't think continuing this conversation is healthy for either of us," and walks away. She doesn't slam the door. She doesn't insult anyone. She simply chooses peace. For someone expecting another emotional debate, this response can feel surprisingly threatening. Without an argument to win, there's no opportunity to confirm their superiority. Without emotional resistance, there's nothing to overcome. They're left alone with a feeling they may rarely face: uncertainty about how they're being perceived. This changes everything. You may notice behaviors that seem contradictory. One day, they may remind you of your happiest memories together, acting affectionate and nostalgic. The next day, they may criticize your personality, question your decisions, or suggest that you'll never find anyone better. These dramatic shifts can seem confusing until you recognize the underlying goal: restoring the emotional connection that once validated their self-image. Almost nobody realizes that consistency is one of the strongest forms of confidence. Real confidence doesn't need constant proof. It doesn't require every disagreement to end in victory. It doesn't depend on controlling another person's emotions. An emotionally healthy person can tolerate disagreement without feeling that their identity is under attack. They can hear no without experiencing it as rejection. They can respect boundaries without seeing them as personal insults. That's an important distinction because emotional maturity isn't measured by how much attention you receive. It's measured by how well you regulate yourself when attention changes. As an empath grows in self awareness, they begin to understand this difference. They stop confusing emotional intensity with genuine intimacy. They realize that being deeply connected to someone doesn't require sacrificing their own emotional stability. And that's where true confidence begins. Not in changing another person's behavior, but in changing your relationship with your own emotions. But here's where the psychology becomes even more fascinating. Once emotional detachment makes control, manipulation, and validation ineffective, many narcissistic personalities make one final attempt to regain influence. They often return in ways that seem caring on the surface but serve a very different psychological purpose underneath. One of the most confusing experiences for many empaths is this. The moment they finally stop chasing the relationship, the other person suddenly reappears. After weeks, months, or even years of silence, a message arrives. It might be casual. It might sound caring. It might even include an apology that seems sincere. Naturally, the first thought is often, have they finally changed? Sometimes people genuinely do grow and take responsibility for their actions. Real personal growth is possible. But here's what almost nobody realizes. A renewed attempt to reconnect is not by itself proof that lasting change has occurred. The real question isn't why they came back. The real question is what has actually changed since they left. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, an empath's emotional detachment can create an unresolved psychological tension. The relationship no longer follows the script they expected. The emotional access they once had is gone. And human beings often feel a strong pull to resolve situations where they no longer understand their place or influence. Have you ever noticed that someone who ignored your needs suddenly becomes incredibly attentive once you've stopped seeking their attention? That shift can feel flattering, but it's important to slow down and observe rather than immediately believe. Emotional intelligence means paying attention to patterns instead of isolated moments. Imagine an empath who spent years hoping for small signs of affection. During the relationship, they often felt invisible. Their concerns were minimized, their boundaries were questioned, and meaningful conversations rarely lasted. Eventually, they accepted the relationship for what it was, focused on healing, rebuilt their confidence, and created a peaceful life without constant emotional turmoil. Then, unexpectedly, a message appears. I've been thinking about you. I've changed. I miss what we had. Those words can awaken old emotions because they speak directly to hopes that once felt impossible. But this is where self-awareness becomes your greatest guide. Instead of asking, do I still love this person? Ask a different question. Does their current behavior consistently reflect accountability, respect, and emotional maturity? Words create hope. Behavior creates trust. And trust is built through consistency, not emotional intensity. Here's where body language and communication become especially revealing. Someone who has genuinely grown usually demonstrates patience. They respect your boundaries, accept your hesitation, and understand that rebuilding trust takes time. They don't pressure you for immediate forgiveness or demand quick emotional reassurance. Their actions show humility because they recognize that trust cannot be negotiated, it must be earned. On the other hand, if someone becomes frustrated the moment you don't respond as expected, if they rush intimacy, dismiss your concerns, or make you feel guilty for protecting yourself, those are signals worth noticing. Healthy reconnection invites choice. Unhealthy reconnection often creates pressure. This changes everything. Emotionally detached people no longer confuse attention with transformation. They understand that someone missing your presence is not automatically the same as someone changing their behavior. Missing access to your emotional energy and developing genuine emotional maturity are two very different things. The greatest sign of healing isn't that someone comes back. It's that you no longer feel compelled to abandon your peace simply because they did. And that's perhaps the strongest form of emotional freedom. You become capable of listening with compassion while still evaluating with wisdom. You can appreciate an apology without ignoring history. You can remain kind without surrendering your boundaries. That balance is what emotional intelligence truly looks like. But there's one final lesson that ties everything together. Emotional detachment isn't really about narcissists at all. It's about the quiet transformation that happens within the empath. The moment they stop seeking permission to protect their own peace and begin living from a place of genuine self respect. By the time an empath reaches true emotional detachment, something profound has already changed. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't caused by a single argument, one broken promise, or one painful betrayal. It happened gradually through countless moments of disappointment, reflection, and emotional exhaustion. Every ignored boundary, every dismissed feeling, and every repeated cycle quietly taught a lesson that words alone never could. Eventually, the empath stops asking one question: how do I make this relationship work? Instead, they begin asking something far more powerful. What kind of relationship allows me to remain emotionally healthy? That single shift changes everything. Here's what most people completely miss. When people say a narcissist can't handle an empath's emotional detachment, it isn't necessarily because they've lost the person. Often, it's because they've lost the emotional influence they once had. Those are two very different things. Think about it. In the past, a single critical comment might have stayed in your mind for days. You replayed conversations, questioned your worth, and searched for ways to fix problems that weren't entirely yours to solve. Your emotional energy became focused on earning understanding, approval, or affection. Now imagine that same criticism reaching someone who has done the inner work. They hear the words. They consider whether there's any truth they can learn from. If there is, they grow. If there isn't, they let it pass without carrying it home emotionally. That isn't indifference, it's emotional maturity. Hey, have you ever noticed how peaceful people rarely feel the need to defend themselves constantly? That's because their confidence no longer depends on convincing everyone else. They understand that not every opinion deserves an emotional response. Some misunderstandings are simply part of life. Some people will never see you clearly, no matter how carefully you explain yourself. And accepting that reality is incredibly freeing. Imagine an empath who once measured their value by how needed they felt. They believed love meant endless patience, endless sacrifice, and endless chances. Over time, however, they discovered something unexpected. Real love doesn't require abandoning yourself. Healthy relationships don't demand that one person carries all the emotional responsibility while the other avoids accountability. So they began making different choices. They stopped chasing conversations that never led to understanding. They stopped apologizing simply to end conflict. They stopped confusing emotional intensity with emotional intimacy. Most importantly, they stopped believing that protecting their own peace was selfish. Almost nobody realizes that boundaries don't push healthy people away. They simply reveal who is willing to respect them. Someone who genuinely values you may not enjoy every boundary you set, but they will learn to honor it because they care about the relationship as much as they care about themselves. Someone who only valued access to your emotional energy, however, often experiences those same boundaries as rejection because they limit control rather than connection. This is where self-awareness becomes more important than analysis. You don't need to spend your life diagnosing every difficult personality you meet. You don't need to prove that someone is a narcissist before deciding a relationship isn't healthy for you. Labels can sometimes help us understand behavior, but they should never replace personal responsibility or careful observation. Instead, pay attention to something much simpler. How do you consistently feel after spending time with someone? Do you feel respected? Do you feel emotionally safe enough to be honest? Can disagreements happen without fear, manipulation, or constant emotional punishment? Can both people admit mistakes, grow together, and protect each other's dignity? Those questions will often tell you far more than any label ever could. The deepest lesson isn't about why narcissists struggle with an empath's emotional detachment. The deepest lesson is that emotional detachment, when it's healthy, isn't the absence of love. It is the presence of self-respect. It is choosing peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, growth over repetition, and emotional freedom over emotional dependence, because the strongest people aren't the ones who control other people's emotions. They're the ones who have learned to understand, regulate, and protect their own. As you move forward, observe people with curiosity instead of judgment. Notice patterns instead of promises. Listen to actions more than words. And above all, remember that the healthiest relationships are never built on fear, guilt, or control. They're built on mutual respect, trust, emotional safety, and the freedom for both people to grow. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about relationship psychology, human behavior, and communication, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our future content. Until next time, stay observant, stay self-aware, and remember, your greatest strength isn't changing someone else's behavior. It's protecting your own peace.